Bernard Levenger. I'm 83 years old. I was born in Germany, in the capital, Berlin. I lived in Berlin until I was 7, and then, because of the Nazis, at the end of 1935, my brother and I went to live with our grandmother, who had moved to Switzerland. We lived with my grandmother all of 1936 and the beginning of 1937. And in 1937 we rejoined our parents in London.
Laurie Levenger. I'm 82. I was born in the free city of Danzig. That's where I spent the first 10 years of my life. We lived in a suburb of the city of Danzig, right by the Baltic Sea. Our house was actually 1 block from the Baltic Sea. We spent a lot of time during the summer at the beach. During the winter time, it was very, very cold often. In fact, it was so cold that sometimes the sea froze in waves.
When we came to London, my parents had bought a house. It was a brand new house on a brand new street. The street was not even paved. We were the last house on the block.
We just played. We had, sometimes I played with friends, and lots of times I just was home. I have a sister that's 6 years older than I am, and we spend time together. We also spent lots of time fighting. There were very nice fields, lovely sort of wildflowers, and it was a very, very pleasant place to live.
The town where my grandmother lived was right across the border from Germany, and there was a Jewish community in the German town Konstanz, which was right across the border, and we used to go to the synagogue. One day, a bunch of Nazi thugs broke into the synagogue and essentially desecrated it. And I think they didn't burn it down, but the whole interior was destroyed. And after that, I felt extremely uncomfortable going into Germany. I was very much aware of the hatred for the Jews that was being promulgated by the Nazis. We were very much aware of what was going on in Germany with the Nazis. I think the idea of being a Jew was mostly kind of a negative thing for me.
It was perfectly fine up until probably 36, 37, 1936, 1937. At that time, it became apparent that this was not a place that was going to be a comfortable place for us to stay. There were signs at stores, Jews not welcome or Jews forbidden, and it was very, very obvious that trouble was brewing. At that point, my parents decided to get papers together to see about leaving the country and moving to another country.
I think in May or June of 1941, all of a sudden our situation in England changed, especially for my father, because he was a man and he was a German citizen, and he was considered dangerous, an enemy alien, and they interned enemy German citizens. My mother was able to get us visas to Mexico, and having the visa to Mexico, which meant that we would leave England, was what got my father out of the internment. So the reason we left England was because as German citizens we were not really welcome in England anymore.
We needed something called an affidavit, which was a guarantee that that you would not be a burden to the state or the government, We needed visas. We had to give up our house, sell most things that we had in the house. We didn't take any furniture. We did take
When we left Liverpool, we left in a convoy with probably something like 30 ships, and there were destroyers, and there were even some things with barrage balloons where they had like blimps which were tethered to barges which would prevent airplanes from flying low.
We left in 1939. We went to Bremen, and Bremen had a port called Bremenhaven, and that's where our ship was. We boarded that ship the end of July. It was my father first with all the papers that he showed to an official that I believe was a Nazi. If any of those papers had not been correct, we would not have been allowed to board and come to the United States. My sister is kind of biting her lip, looking nervous. It took about about a week to make the voyage across the ocean. The war actually started in September of 1939, so we really just made it. The ship that we went on was actually torpedoed and sunk. Never made another voyage.
It took about 4 weeks to get from Liverpool to the Panama Canal. We were driven to the airport in Panama City and got on a plane, and it was a very exciting day for me because in those days airplanes, they were not jets, they were propeller planes, and this plane flew from Panama and it stopped in Costa Rica, then in Nicaragua, then in San Salvador, and in Honduras. And every time we stopped, everybody got off the plane, and we stayed in the airport for, 20, 30 minutes, and then we got back on the plane and went on. And they didn't fly at night, so when we got to Guatemala, they put us up in a hotel in Guatemala City overnight, and it was kind of fun. There was like a street fair. And the next day, we went on to Mexico City. So that was quite an adventure, that airplane ride. I said I was in 5 countries in one day. It was very exciting for a 12-year-old. We had to go to the immigration authorities, and they told us we had come into the United States illegally. So they sent us to an immigration prison. So what happened was that the airline had to take us back to Mexico City, and we still had our visa and we were allowed to come, but we weren't allowed to immigrate directly from Mexico City, from Mexico, because there was a law that was passed during World War I that said you had to have been a resident of Mexico for at least 2 years or have been in the United States previously legally. And so we flew to Havana, and we stayed in Havana for 2 or 3 days. Havana was beautiful. And then we got on a cruise ship and took that cruise ship to New York. Then the only trouble was when we got to New York City, everybody else got off the boat, and they kept us on the boat overnight. And the next day we had to go to Ellis Island to have an immigration interview, but fortunately that went well, and then we finally were in the United States legally.
We arrived in New York on the docks on the west side of New York. We arrived August 4th, 1939. It was a blazing hot day. A relative met us, a distant relative. The first question that I asked him was, why don't they turn off the heat? And so then the relative asked, he said, would you like something to drink? Are you thirsty? And I said, sure. And that was my first Coca-Cola.
My parents took a trip to California because they really even wanted to move to California. But at some point between the time that we had first been in California and the summer of 1941, a law was passed which essentially meant my father was a doctor, that he wouldn't be able to practice in California. So they decided to stay in New York. They got an apartment in Manhattan.
Well, for me, it was just a very exciting adventure. I mean, I came from a small town to a huge city. Just not knowing the language and getting used to a very, very different society was not so easy for my parents. And for my sister, it was hard because she was 16 years old, and because it was difficult to get jobs, she was the first one in the family that got a job. She was a nanny, a live-in nanny for a family that lived out on Long Island and came just to visit on weekends. And I think that was very hard for her. But for me, it was really pretty easy.
So I lived in Manhattan until I graduated from high school in 1945 and went to college. I think I kind of fit in. I don't remember feeling particularly different.
Okay, when we first came to New York, we didn't have very much money anymore because it took a lot of money for us to get to the United States. And we lived in a very large apartment where people had one room and shared a kitchen and bathrooms. So for me it was a very, very nice situation, but eventually we did get our own apartment, and my mother got a job. So my sister worked, my mother worked. My father had much more trouble getting a job. It took quite a while before he got a full-time job. And then Bernie invited me to a party, and that's sort of how our romance started. We got married October 24th, 1954. I was 25 years old and Bernie was 26. We had dated for a while, about a 1.5-year breakup, but then we got back together again and decided, when Bernie got a deferment from the Army, we decided to get married in 1954. We've now been married for 58 years, and I think neither one of us has ever regretted choosing each other.